Stick around because today we're going to talk about your story's premise and how you can make it more meaningful and original. What's up, guys? My name is Brandon McNulty. I'm a writer, I'm the author of Bad Parts, and welcome to my writing channel. Today I want to talk about your story's premise. And we all know what a premise is. It's a basic one-line description of what your story is about. It's your log line, it's your elevator pitch, whatever you want to call it. But the problem with the story's premise is that oftentimes it's just too simple. And when it's simple, sometimes it can be generic. For instance, the premise of The Walking Dead is that a group of people must survive in the wake of a zombie apocalypse, which is pretty much as generic as it gets when it comes to zombie apocalypse stories. So how does a story like that succeed? And the answer to that is how the story is told. And this is what I really want to talk about in today's video. I want to talk about this idea called the designing principle. And the design principle is something that's discussed in a bunch of different writing guides. Most notably, it's discussed in John Truby's book, The Anatomy of Story. And in The Anatomy of Story, Truby says that the designing principle is basically a strategy for your storytelling. It's the overall strategy. It's how you organize your story and everything in it. So basically what you do, you take a premise and you look at that premise, you investigate it, you think about it, and you ask yourself, how can I tell it in a unique and meaningful way? The best way to understand the designing principle is to look at the premise and understand that the premise is what your story is about. The designing principle, on the other hand, is how you tell that story. And that's where unique ideas and unique approaches come into play. And that's where you get meaning in your stories, because that's where you inject yourself into the story. Now, the key thing to remember with your designing principle is that you want to use it to shape your story. And I think there are three types of designing principles. The first one I want to talk about is theme, symbol, and metaphor. These are probably the most common types of designing principles out there. That's why I grouped them together. But theme is a very common one, and I want to give you some examples that help illustrate what I mean by this. For instance, I already talked about The Walking Dead, and I explained that the premise of The Walking Dead is that a group of people must survive in a zombie apocalypse. That's the premise. That's pretty simple, pretty generic. Now, the designing principle of this story is a theme, and it's a theme of rebuilding civilization. That's really what The Walking Dead is about. It's not just about survival, which is what most horror stories and most zombie stories are about. It's about rebuilding civilization. So when you're thinking about The Walking Dead's designing principle, I would say something like this. I would say a group of survivors must find a way to rebuild civilization in the wake of a zombie apocalypse. That's much more specific, much more interesting, and much more structured and organized compared to that original premise of just people surviving in the zombie apocalypse. Now, how about another example? Let's take a look at the movie Rocky. Rocky is about a down-and-out boxer who gets an opportunity to face off against the heavyweight champion of the world. That's a pretty generic underdog story, nothing really exciting there. But the designing principle in Rocky is the theme of rebirth, and we see this from the very first image in the movie. We see resurrection and rebirth throughout the story. It's what shapes it. And if you wanted to, rewrite that premise with the designing principle in mind, you might say something like, a down-and-out boxer fights to reclaim his life both in and outside the boxing ring, or something along those lines. The important thing is that you are incorporating that theme, and that theme is shaping the story. Now, one more example of theme as the designing principle would be in The Mandalorian, and this is a story about a bounty hunter who works jobs in the aftermath of a galactic war. And that's not the most exciting or original premise, but when we shift things and we look at the theme of the story, we see something that's much more interesting. And the theme that is at the heart of The Mandalorian is about a man who adopts a child and becomes a father. So that's something that ultimately shapes the story, and it makes it more interesting than just any old shoot-'em-up Star Wars story. Now, a second type of designing principle is what I call time gimmicks, and you're probably familiar with these. For instance, a great example would be any type of non-linear story. For instance, Pulp Fiction, where the scenes are all out of order and you make sense of the story as you go along. That's a great example of a story that uses a time gimmick to give the story originality and meaning. Another example would be the movie Memento, which is told backwards. And not only is it told backwards as like a stylistic thing, but it also ties into the main character who has memory issues. And this, of course, ties into the plot as well, so it shapes that entire story. Yet another example would be any type of story where you open up with one particular scene where something tragic happens, and then you cut cut to the past in order to show how we got there. For instance, the movie Casino is something like this, where we open up with Robert De Niro's character getting into a car. He starts the ignition, the car explodes. We're wondering, wow, why did that guy just get blown up? And then we get the whole story behind it. Now, the third type of designing principle is what I call modernizing a classic. And this is something you're probably familiar with. I'm sure you've heard of a story that was described as a modernized fairy tale, or a modernized take on Shakespeare, or a modernized whatever. And this is something that's pretty common because it works, and it's a great way to shape a story because it's based off a story that has worked in the past and that people are familiar with. For instance, the movie Pretty Woman has a really simple premise. It's about a prostitute who falls in love with a billionaire. Nothing special about that. But what made that story meaningful was the fact that it was a retelling of Cinderella. Another great example would be The Lion King. This is about a lion cub who comes of age in a jungle kingdom. Nothing really mind-blowing about that, but the fact that it's a retelling of Shakespeare's Hamlet makes it something that's much more interesting, and that Hamlet story helps shape everything about The Lion King and brings it to another level. Now, regardless of which type of designing principle you're using to tell your story, you need to remember that when you do come up with a premise, it's typically going to be something that is simple, and it might even sound generic. But that's okay, because how you tell the story is much more important. You need to play around with that premise, stretch it in different directions, take some risks, find a way to bring that premise to a whole nother level, and thereby bring your story to the next level. So I hope this helps. Question of the day: what is one example of a story with a boring premise that you ended up loving? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, be sure to pick up a copy of Bad Parts. Also, take a look at my other videos, hit the like and subscribe buttons for me, share this video with a friend, and as always, remember to keep on writing.